Joining us now to talk about the future of unions, Charlotte Yates. She is Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at McMaster University in Hamilton, and we're glad to have you back in the studio.
Hi, Steve.
Let me share with you and our viewers a chart that I think everybody suspects in their bones they know is true, and then we'll come back and talk a bit about that. Michael, if you would, this is the average hourly earnings last year according to StatsCan, and if you are a full-time unionized person in this country, you make a good wage, $25 an hour. If you're full-time non-unionized, it's a little less. If you're part-time unionized, it's almost as much as if you were full-time non-unionized. And of course, part-time non-unionized workers make the least down there at $13, $16 an hour. We know if you're unionized, you make more money, but tell us this. How do these wages break down when we separate the public and the private sector? Because this chart doesn't do that, but do you know how it breaks down that way?
I mean, and first of all, there are two impacts of public-private on those figures. For one thing, you have about 70% plus of the unionized workforce in Canada. Ontario is in the public sector compared to in the private sector. In fact, in Ontario, it's probably a little bit more because unionization rates in the private sector are so low. So in that sense, it does have, that figure will reflect the overwhelming influence, obviously, of the public sector. Having said that, when you look at it, you'll find that really what's more important is by industry than by public-private. So in other words, what we call the union wage premium, which is what your table shows, is really going to be greater for the resource sector, manufacturing, like auto and steel, for example, than it might be in subsections of the private sector, such as security guards or cleaners, for example.
I'm actually going to come back to that later. We've got a chart on that too. But while we're here, let's talk pensions. According to the Canadian Labour Congress, 80% of union members in Canada, 80% have a workplace pension. What role would you say unions play in that fact?
Oh, unions are an enormous factor. If we look at the breakdown union, non-union, then we find that you are much more likely to have a pension because, in fact, that's one of the major things that unions bargain for. Even more significant is the impact of unions on women's access to pensions. If you break it down by gender, women who are unionized have a far, far greater chance of having coverage by pensions. And again, it's because there is a greater premium, if you will, associated with union membership for women, both in terms of wages and benefits, than there is for men.
And benefits in general?
Benefits, what we're talking about, pension, extra medical care, dental care, drugs coverage are probably the four greatest of those.
And the role that unions play in securing those for employees?
Well, certainly, again, along with the wage package, benefits are probably one of the most significant things that unions bargain for, but also across the board, whether it be some of the lower paid unions are trying to experiment with new ways of providing benefits because members often join unions because, not just because of the wages, but because of those other benefits.
Let's talk about the broader role unions play in society. I know once upon a time, and you tell me if it's still the case, once upon a time, if there was a major controversial issue happening in this country or around the world, unions would be involved, either taking a public position on it or getting unionized employees out to whatever, march in the streets, whatever. Is that still as much the case today?
I think it's declined over time, and I think it's partly, so unions still articulate the views. I think they're heard less by the public, heard less by the media, and there's a couple of different reasons for that. I think if we look worldwide at unionization rates, what you'll find is that union density, or the proportion of the workforce that is unionized in most Western industrialized countries, has been on the decline, in some countries really precipitously. So once you have a decline in membership and in density, it means that your influence is less, and therefore opinion makers are less likely to look to you for your ideas, even though you may be articulating them. The other thing is that there's been a real shift in terms of the way in which unions have been able to effectively frame their issues. If we look in the 50s and 60s, they were somehow able to mobilize not just their membership, but public opinion and support.
Can't do that anymore?
That's less so. I think it's harder to do. I think partly because there's competing groups that mobilize that public's opinion. But the other side of it is unions have over time been eroded in their public face in so much as people think, oh, unions, they go on strike. There's been tremendous pressure against unions and kind of less attention paid to the positive benefits that they provide to working people.
Apropos of the first thing you said there, we do have another handy-dandy chart here on the unionization rate in this country over the past 10 years or so. And you know, without getting specific about the numbers, I think everybody can see that that line is going down, with not too many upticks in it through the course of the past decade. Does this chart show that unions are becoming increasingly irrelevant in society?
No, I think in fact that chart is a little misleading only because it kind of exaggerates the change. If you look at the real numbers, what you find is that goes from about 33% to about 29.7% change. So a fairly modest shift. I'm not trying to downplay it, but nonetheless modest. But the other side of it is if you had a graph showing total union membership, you would find that total union membership in Canada continues to grow. So even though the proportion of the workforce is less that is unionized, the total membership is growing. So nonetheless, there is a relative stagnation in union membership. I think that it says that unions are having a harder time representing workers. I think if we look at opinion polls on whether workers would like to be unionized, there's still a large number of the workforce that would like to be unionized but is not. So it tells you that there is a gap, but whether it means unions are less relevant or just that they have a harder time representing workers is two different types of questions.
Well, let's go through a checklist here of potential reasons why. Globalization, what role would that be playing in the decline of union membership?
Certainly globalization means that in terms of the employers and investors are able to be much more mobile and agile in the global economy. So faced with unionization, they're able to shut down and relocate in many instances. So it gives greater leverage to employers and makes it harder for unions to, in fact, mobilize memberships. The other side of globalization is that it means that, especially in North America, there's been a growth in some sectors which have been harder to organize, like the service sector, whereas there's been a decline and a shift to other countries of sectors which have traditionally been centers of union strength, such as manufacturing and certain production side of unions.
How about contracting out work? Employers seem to be prepared to do that more often than not.
Absolutely, and for unions that's posed a challenge. Many unions try to what we call chase those contracted out workers by trying to organize them, but it is much, much harder because the incentive for employers to contract out is, of course, cheaper labor costs. So in that sense, it makes it harder for unions, but it also means that often those employers of the contracted out workers are much more willing to fight unions really, really hard in order to stay union free and therefore maintain their kind of wage cost advantage.
I want to be careful in the way I say this, but unions seem to have a particular relevancy to people of a certain age, if you know what I mean. Younger people today don't seem to have the, well, they certainly don't have the history or the background, necessarily the background knowledge with the union movement. And I wonder if, as a result, their expectations of unions are different than people, again, of a certain age. What do you think on that?
I think the question is it the young workers themselves that aren't interested in unions, or is it the fact that they tend to be employed in jobs in which unions have a very hard time getting kind of representation rights? So, for example, young workers are much more likely to be on short-term contracts, much more likely to be temporary, casual, or part-time workers. They also tend to be in sectors such as the private service sector, whether it be in the Starbucks or whether it be working in some area of retail, and therefore it means that those are exactly the sectors where unions have not had a strength. So the question will be, will those workers, once they reach a more stable job, will they then join unions and become the new membership of the unions?
Got another chart for this. Let's go to the last chart here, and this one is on job holders versus income. You can see the so-called creative class makes up about 29% of our employment force. The service class, that's the red line in the middle, 46%, very large here. 22% the working class. Look at the disproportionate amount of income then that the creative class makes, 42%, compared to the disproportionate amount less earned by the service class and the working class about the same. Again, the type of job that people get, is it more important than whether those jobs are unionized in terms of whether you're going to be quote unquote successful?
That's a complex question, so let's break it down a bit. First of all, I think if you look carefully within the creative class, you'll find that actually a fairly significant number of those creative class workers are in fact unionized, whether it be film industry. Film industry has a high rate of unionization, whether you're looking at the Actors Guild, directors, writers, and so on, or the kind of walk-ons as in BC, where they unionized thousands of workers not just a few years ago.
Or the guy taking your picture right now.
Exactly, absolutely.
Behind that camera. Okay.
So there's a high rate of unionization in certain sectors of the creative class. If you think of university professors, if they're part of the creative class, they have higher, if anything, over the last 10 years, growing rates of unionization. So I think, though, that there is some element of truth to the fact that the kind of work you do also does tend to predict the kind of income. One impact unions have is to raise the income, especially of those people who end up in jobs that are not as good jobs. So in a sense, they have a countervailing tendency on what might be natural market tendencies.
So there's a disproportionately high amount of income earned by those in the creative class, both because the market respects those jobs and because they're inordinately unionized as well.
Some of them are heavily unionized.
So the problem then goes to the service class, where almost half the people are working there now, but not so unionized, and therefore their wages are low.
Exactly. That's part of it, but also because we don't value them. But also the service class, of course, has a lot more market fluctuation in terms of employment. So it means that you also don't reap the benefits of long-term employment often.
Let me get you to speak to this, because one of the criticisms that I've often heard about people in unionized workplaces is that the nature of the contract between employer and union is such that the workplace rules are very strict. You are allowed to push that button. You are not allowed to push that button. You can do this. You can't do that. It seems that the world is becoming increasingly less like that. We're increasingly in a world where everybody's got to know how to do everything. So again, to the question of relevancy, how relevant can unions be in a workplace where you need to be more flexible, you need to do more things, you need to have fewer artificial walls between jobs, but that doesn't seem to be the way it's always been.
And I think that's very true of older unions established in manufacturing workplaces in the 50s, 60s. The model of unionization and bargaining they used was job specific. So it defined very carefully what that job was and what you did in that job and the demarcations between jobs. Over the last 10 to 15 years, unions have been pressed by employers, but have also realized in order to maintain their relevance, they have to negotiate greater flexibility, multitasking, multi-skilling.
Are they open to that?
And they are starting to do that, some more than others. I mean, some they've had to in order to get into new areas of the workforce, but certainly that's been a challenge for unions. But if you look at the auto industry or you look at the service industry, you start to see some significant changes in terms of how grocery stores are, unionized grocery stores are organized. That reflects a kind of engagement with a flexibility agenda. Similarly with the auto industry. So unions have had to respond to that challenge.
But I wonder whether you think they're adapting fast enough, given, I mean, the pace of change nowadays in the workplace is just staggering. Are unions adapting fast enough?
I don't know. I mean, and that's a tough one to answer, and I'm not sure on what basis one would argue whether they are or not. I think there's some evidence that certainly they're responding to changes in the workplace, but also in the marketplace. I think also, though, to some extent, unions' role is to make sure that change is done in a way that is not going to harm workers disproportionately. And so in that sense, for some people, that may be seen as an impediment to change. But to unions, they may be saying, hang on, some changes just are not good for working people, or working people in that firm pay an especially high price for that change, in which case then the union is likely to resist that change. And for many, one would say then that's a good thing, because one must protect particularly vulnerable workers, and that is the role of unions.
I understand that point. Okay, let me do one last thing with you, and that is if you take a handful of companies, Google, Magna, Toyota, I mean, these are companies that are often praised for their good management, employee relations rather. They don't have unions at these companies. I wonder whether you think we are entering a kind of a really, writ large post-union phase in our industrial relations right now.
I think there are two elements to that, an answer to that question. And one of them is, I think you're right to say, if we look at if we go back to one of the earlier charts about why unionization is in decline, it's partly because there's been a rise in the success of non-union employers, often in sectors which have traditionally as well unionized, like Magna or Toyota, which at one time that industry was much more heavily unionized until those players came into play. There is, though, an element of, to some extent, in heavily unionized industries where non-union firms have been highly successful, it's often because they've been able to counter unions. In other words, Toyota and Magna partly was successful because they pay comparable wages and benefits to what union members get in the unionized
This is
firms.
like Stelco and DeFasco in our hometown.
Absolutely. So in that sense, there is that impact of unions on the non-union sector. In terms of Google is a little different, and I think that's where we go back to your question of the creative class. And I think that there is some element of, if you can harness creativity and you can create good working conditions, and I think we do live in an era when human resource management has paid a lot more attention to how to make workers in certain types of jobs happy in order to harness their creative abilities. The difficulty is that that's matched on the other side with some really bad employers in many sectors, and those are the areas where I think unions continue to maintain kind of significant gains.
Understood. Charlotte Yates from McMaster University, as always, thanks for visiting us at
Thanks,
TBO.
Steve.